Hello Internet, I'm Sam, and today we are going to talk about an absolutely massive company called Volkswagen. At this point, I think they're going to buy every company in the automotive field since they have been gobbling up companies in Europe. But we ain't here to talk about mergers and acquisitions. We are here to talk about the good, bad, and ugly of Volkswagen. All right, first disclaimer, since Volkswagen does own a ton of stuff, we are just going to concentrate on things with a VW logo on them. Second disclaimer, I'm not really a Euro car guy, and I'll admit it. If I missed something, feel free to drop a comment down below. And also, if you haven't subscribed, you should do that. We are trying to hit 1 million subscribers and really appreciate everyone who has subscribed. Anywho, let's start with the good of Volkswagen. And what better place to start than with a car I know is near and dear to a lot of you. That would be the Volkswagen Golf. This practical, lovable car was actually introduced in 1974 as a replacement for the Love Bug, aka the Beetle. Even in basic bitch trim level, the different iterations of the Golf are fantastic. Yeah, you might have your favorite generation, but honestly, they are all good in their own right. The Golf is similar to the Civic that I talked about in the Honda episode of this series. It's a basic car that's meant to be practical at first. That means the car is generally simpler and thus lighter. Pair that with a manual gearbox and a fun little engine, and you have a classic recipe for success. Oh yeah, and some extra crazy engineers at Volkswagen actually worked in secret on a better, faster version of the Golf. That gave us the absolute unit of the GTI. Kleine GTI, du siehst prima aus. The GTI is the OG of what has been coined as hot hatches and saw commercial success with the larger motor, aero changes, wider arches, and a little red frame around the grille. We now have 8 marquee marks of the VW Golf, and there are fans for each and every version. Personally, I enjoy the Mark 1 and the Mark 7s. The Mark 4 is probably in third place for me, but seems to be absolutely everywhere when it comes to meats. Toss a Mark 4 and some old school BBS, and you have an absolute winner. Quick side note on wheels here. I don't think you can go wrong with a set of BBS or rotiforms on a Golf. Super, super good. Most of you guys seem to enjoy the more modern GTIs, and I consider that modern era to start with a Mark 5 and that little turbo that came with it. The tuning potential exploded here, just like with any turbo platform. Maybe Gels should get one of these, he's never had a turbo car. The Mark 5 also had a DSG, which is a love or hate it kind of thing. Anywho, y'all love the Golf, and we should probably just do an episode on the Golf since it has been around for so long. VW has sold more than 35 million of these hatches since the first edition. But I gotta mention the R32 and Golf R before we are done here. These are the best versions of the car if you're to think performance-wise, and the VR6 and the R32 sound insane, probably one of the best sounding motors out there. The Golf R is also fast, but also pretty gnarly when the weather gets tough because it's got the 4-motion all-wheel drive system. The VR6 should be mentioned on the good list too, since this seems to be a pretty desirable motor for us enthusiasts. It did come in some good cars and trim levels, but the engine itself is pretty darn interesting. Why not just call it a V6 Volkswagen? Well, the VR kind of combines traditional V layout and a straight cylinder layout. There's only one cylinder head here for what would usually be 2 different banks. This packaging allows Volkswagen to put a 6-cylinder in a space that usually only a 4-cylinder could fit, and gives you some better power and torque. They also sound frickin' sick, like I mentioned before. Colin, play a sound clip like here. They're awesome. Next on the good list is another Volkswagen you are probably familiar with, the Volkswagen Jetta.
The Volkswagen Jetta.
The Jetta is great, but compared to the Golf's 35 million in sales, the Jetta only sold 14 million. Jokes aside, 14 million is absolutely crazy. The Jetta debuted in 1979 and was similar to the Golf, which came out just before being a practical car to people, but this one's a little bit bigger and more of a sedan, practical for a family. It's a little bit more of that family car compared to the Golf, and a little comfier with some luxury features. We are on the 7th generation of the Jetta right now, and some specs of the Jetta are capable of up to 46 miles per gallon, which is insane for a car that doesn't look like a crazy, fuel-efficient, robot-looking thing that every manufacturer does when their fuel-efficient car has to stand out. Our third car on this list for the good section is none other than the Beetle. This little bug has been around since the 1930s, but became super popular in pop culture during the hippie days of the 60s and then off into the 70s. I think most of y'all know the story of the Beetle, and we could probably and honestly should do a whole episode on it, but This is a super simple car outside of the modern ones, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We are talking about the Beetle that came to fame as Herbie the Love Bug, like the original movies, not like the modern interpretation. The rear engine layout in the Bug was interesting, but the fact that it was air-cooled was even crazier. But that meant it was very, very simple. My dad used to have a Beetle when he was younger and said it was almost easier to just change and replace the whole engine instead of trying to diagnose what was wrong, because it was so easy to pull out and they were so cheap and plentiful. The simplicity of these cars led to some crazy modifications and different versions of the car. The Super Beetle was a little souped up version, but my favorite has to be the Baja Bug, and I usually find myself looking for one on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace every year. I really should just buy one because it's absolutely cool. Finally, I want to mention Volkswagen's eye for practicality in the good section. This is a bit of a catch-all, but the company wouldn't be so successful if they didn't have the consumer in mind and what the masses would be looking for. I mentioned both the Golf and Jetta being practical, along with the Beetle being some affordable transportation. A lot of the Volkswagen lineup are not exactly enthusiast cars, not even just cars, a lot of vans as well. The microbus is super cool, small addition of that, but they meet everyday needs. There are just a lot of wagons that Volkswagen offers that are super practical. A lot of these models don't have crazy horsepower numbers, but they have great miles per gallon, especially with the diesel options, which is awesome. But it ain't all good. Let's start the bad section with working on Volkswagens. So every car has its quirks when working on it, but I gotta say that Volkswagen can be some of the quirkiest I've put my hands on. Torx bolts seem to be everywhere, and if you work on Volkswagens a lot, you probably have the tools and sizes of tools needed for these cars, but they aren't just common 10 millimeters and such. There are some weird ones in there. Parts also tend to be a little bit more expensive coming out of Germany compared to anything domestic, obviously, but even compared to our friends in Japan, the Germans are kind of pricey and there isn't always an aftermarket solution that's cost effective. I looked up the reliability ratings of Volkswagens and it wasn't a top performer. It was just above average for most places I could find a rating, but the repair costs are really what hurt the brand the most. When something does go wrong, it's usually a bit more expensive to repair and buy that part compared to the other competing brands. This one is kind of nitpicky, but folks at the office were pretty quick to remind me of it when they heard I was going to do a good, bad, and ugly on Volkswagen. That would be how and who were instrumental in Volkswagen's start. That would be none other than Adolf Hitler, who was part of the Nazi Party just before World War II. The People's Car Company eventually turned into what we now know as Volkswagen. The intent with starting the company was to provide an affordable and practical car to the masses, which is a noble thing and makes sense. Well, the Nazis ended up doing some things that were a little less than stellar, and their actions, along with their tie to starting Volkswagen, gets brought up almost every time when you talk about the brand. It's kind of a meme now. Nazis are bad. I hope we can agree on that, but their tie to Volkswagen is also bad in that sense. I also want to say that anyone who brings up Volkswagen as a Nazi car company is really diminishing the current contributions and work from the folks at Volkswagen. This is a little controversial one, but I want to throw the launch of the new Beetle in the bad section. It wasn't a commercial failure and was not meant to sell a bajillion units either. It was meant to be a cool modern retro version for a generation that now had some disposable income and loved the Beetle when they were younger. Ford was doing this sort of thing with the Mustang and Thunderbird at the same time. The new Beetle looks super cool and retro and really captured the public's attention, but like the Ford Thunderbird, you just didn't get a ton for what you were paying for. It wasn't super sporty in the most popular trim, and the interior really wasn't luxurious either. These things also rode like shit. If you had one, like, it is the roughest riding car from the factory I think I've ever been in. Once you got past the quirky exterior and interior, there just wasn't much substance there that kept consumers interested. I do think the facelift, making it look a little bit more aggressive, was excellent, and you can mod these cars to be very cool. Just the initial launch and the nostalgia wearing off fast kind of sucked, and there just wasn't a whole lot there. Okay, time for the ugly part of Volkswagen. We're going to start this off with Dieselgate. During this debacle, Volkswagen lied about the emissions that were coming out of some of their diesel engines. Car and Driver did a nice job summing this up, so I snagged a bunch of my information there. Volkswagen installed software on 10.5 million vehicles worldwide that could sense a test cycle for emissions happening, and the engine would basically cheat its way and fake it to make it and pass the test. This means that the motor would perform differently during a test than normal driving conditions. What this really affected was the power and torque put out. During normal driving, you get a little that you wouldn't get during the test, and the emissions would correlate with that. Not gonna lie, this is super deceitful and dishonest, but pretty freaking clever. Use your powers for good, Volkswagen, not for evil. The 2-liter in the TDI was the most affected motor that you could find here in the States. Volkswagen tried to make things right with a buyback program for those affected, and oh boy was this hilarious. Depending on the year, trim, etc., Volkswagen was giving owners between $12,500 and $44,000 for their cars. Right away, people got crafty and started pulling stuff off their cars, including doors, hoods, etc., to see what Volkswagen would buy back. Of course, they put some restrictions on this since right away that they said, we'll just buy stuff back, and they're basically buying rolling VIN tags, but people took advantage of it, and then Volkswagen had to dial it back. There's some funny stories out there. If you didn't sell your car back to Volkswagen, the big VW would give you some cash to make up for the shit resale value that your vehicle now have, along with a free emissions tune. How nice of them, that's super cool. It's just what they should have done to start with. People got in trouble at Volkswagen for this, including some jail time. Volkswagen also lost a bunch of money through buybacks and getting in legal trouble. Uncle Sam, well, he slapped Volkswagen with $4.3 billion in criminal and civil penalties as just one example. What Volkswagen lost the most, though, is consumer trust and confidence. Money hurts to lose, but losing future customers kind of cuts your legs out from under you. This is probably the ugliest part of the whole thing. I think a lot of people have kind of moved on from Dieselgate, but there's a huge segment of people that just don't trust Volkswagen as much as they used to. Let's end this ugly section on something maybe you didn't already know about, because Dieselgate was pretty big news. Let's talk about the Volkswagen Phaeton. I don't think this is an ugly car at all. It's an extremely understated luxury car that could be hiding a frickin' W12 under the hood. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might think you're just looking at like a big Passat or something when you see one of these. What I want to talk about in the ugly section is Volkswagen's ability to sell this super cool car, especially in North America. In 2004, which was the highest sales year for the Phaeton in North America, Volkswagen couldn't even sell 2,000 units. In 2005, sales were about 40% of that, if I'm being generous. So then Volkswagen stopped selling them around these parts after the 2006 model year. These cars are super rare, and most people think that's because the Volkswagen badge didn't demand the premium Volkswagen was charging compared to something from Mercedes or BMW. Yes, I know parts of the Phaeton were used across the Volkswagen's conglomerate of cars, but a company the size of Volkswagen seemed to have no idea how to market the Phaeton, and that's just plain ugly, and I can't believe they screwed that up because that car is awesome. This was a fun one, guys, and I appreciate you watching. Don't forget to drop a comment down below, and let's talk about Volkswagen. If you think something belongs somewhere in the good, bad, or ugly sections, make sure you say that in the comment. I appreciate you guys watching. I'm Sam. Peace.